so her horse had rested enough to get her to the border. The night wore on and a pale blue stripe of dawn defined the horizon. How the mare had managed to pick her way south Osrith did not know, but she did know she had stolen an exceedingly good beast. Her mouth still tingled from the extremely passionate kiss Finan had given to her, and if Osrith was a different type of woman, she would be heading back to Winchester to wait for him. But Osrith was a warrior, and there was no waiting around for a man for her. She was going home. To Aylesbury. But she wasn't there yet, nor would be that day, if she did not get past the frontier guards. Osrith recognized some of them, in their green and gold, but they were not trained to ask questions first, and Osrith, being tired, had completely messed up as she had tried to step onto non-Danelaw soil. The spear was the first clue to her error, and Osrith had fallen from her mare, only for it to run, at speed, back in the direction of Danish territory, along with most of her belongings. She drove away. Thamia Mercia! Osrith shouted, forgetting herself, which caused the four men to chase after her, in not a very effective tactical maneuver, she thought, when she had decided where to run to. No point in trying to hide, they would be trained, at least, to search everywhere, and Osrith meant everywhere. Aldhelm's training, disseminated through Mirral, was somewhat pedantic on that point. So, babies' cribs were upended, wells were inspected. Going to the barn, just delayed capture, for it was the first place anyone would look, whether they were a guard or not. So, an active hiding place then, Osrith thought, inhaling deeply, as she looked about the wooden homesteads that constituted this border hamlet's position, that was, to find somewhere to be, then move around as the guards moved around. It was only when Osrith looked about her that she realized, with joy, that she knew the place, and, too, the Shul who acted as Shire Reeve, though there were only 3 families in the place. Rich pickings, as families had moved from the turbulent frontier, yet always vulnerable, and it was to her astonishment that Osrith realized a burh was being built around the settlement. Why here, when the place was so small? Osrith thought, as she crept into the back gate of a farmstead. The family of Godylf lived here, Danish father, Saxon mother, 3 children. A sheep barred gently as she closed the door. Beyond the next was the hall, and above, where the family were sleeping. As predicted, footsteps trod the mud at the back of the farmstead, and the SHSH made it very clear to her, and to anyone else listening, that they were trying to be surreptitious, but not making a very good job of it. Osrith moved through into the hall. The smoke from the fire which had been allowed to burn out was almost gone. This was going to be easy, Osrith thought, as she made her way to the front door, which was covered by a heavy curtain of cloth. Moving it to one side, she managed to get behind it and through the wooden door, into the beginnings of the morning. Osrith could hear talking behind her, now in the hall. The guards had entered the hall and were looking for her, and she stopped dead as a thunder down a staircase rattled the whole of the structure. Godylf getting up and finding what intruders were in his hall, no doubt. Yes, Osrith thought, to her satisfaction, as Saxon, Anglish and Anglish-Danish voices began to talk quickly. Then Osrith had the presence of mind to dash from the door, and pull herself up into the thatch. Below, she could see through the rafters 3 men talking to the big estate owner. Godylf was haranguing the men, a blade in his hand, for, presumably, marauding through his home in the early hours of the morning. But, where was the first? Osrith eased herself around through the thatch, so that she could see down into the grounds. No one. By now, other people were talking loudly in the ground floor of the house, and a baby began to howl, presumably awakened by the racket. Osrith could see that, if she could make it, quickly, through the beams to the mezzanine, where one person was sleeping, she would be able to make it down the other side of the structure, and still keep an eye out for one guard, who would surely be looking in as many places as he could, by now. Keeping her right leg in contact with the beam, Osrith made a leap, hoping it would be good enough. She landed beside the sleeping person, a girl, who woke with a start. "Never mind me," Osrith said, as cheerily as she could, as the girl stared at her, but then began to scream as Osrith hurried past her. However, the scream was not because of Osrith. Beside her, The fourth guard bore down a cudgel towards her, and she only just about leapt out of the way in time. And then, Osrith realized that the guard was not going for her, but for the girl, and was, now, pulling at her clothing while all the time the noise from below was disguising the attack. But the guard did not figure on Osrith. As the girl screamed again, a sound which was aborted about a second after the guard's hand clamped over her mouth, Osrith brought the cudgel down onto the back of the man's head. She hoped she hadn't killed him. The girl stared at her in fright, as a hammering up steps came again. Godulf was furious, and even more furious when he saw Osrith standing in the family's sleeping platform holding a big hammer. Him. The girls pointed towards the unconscious man as Godulf raised his shoulders and had begun to bear down on Osrith. Osrith dropped the cudgel and leapt past Godulf, tumbling from the platform. She caught hold of a rope which was holding meat hanging to dry from the ceiling of the small hall, and somehow managed to right herself enough to land at the feet of the first three guards. And looked into their faces for a brief moment. Oshir. Put down your sword. You too, Eglfrith. She glanced above. Him, I don't know, Osrith continued, as she moved towards the third man. And him? Eardulf, Captain. Oshir's voice jumped as he spoke, in his astonishment at addressing his former leader. And he is a mercenary guard? She asked, feigning doubt in her voice as two of her past warriors stood before her, much taller and broader, but the same keen faces, eager to do their duty, fierce at the idea that they had caught an intruder into both Mercia and Godulf's home. Eardulf stood tall, his eyes glaring at Osrith, hand wrapped overtly around his sword hilt. Who is this? Godulf, who had leapt the distance down from the roof, turned Osrith roughly by the shoulder. And then grinned. They had fought next to one another as they had guarded the frontier there many times before. Osrith. Godulf. Osrith returned his greeting with equal enthusiasm. I apologize for entering your home, I was crossing the border. She glanced up past Godulf, flicking her eyes to his wife. Iajifu, another baby? The woman had only two the last time she was there, the girl, who was still upstairs, and the young boy by his mother's legs. Thora, Iajifu said. It was a sign of a mixed marriage where names were bisected and remade, to bizarre effect. But at least this third name was wholly Danish, unlike her father's, brothers and sisters' names, which were hybrids of two cultures. And then Osrith remembered the man above them, his arm falling over the boarding. Who is he? Osrith demanded of Oshir. She looked past him when the man did not answer, and across to Eardulf when the usually chatty Eglfrith did not answer either. Our captain, Eardulf said eventually, and only when Osrith had hand on Bue's hilt. Sigefirth. And to whom do you report? Osrith asked. Aldhelm? The Lord Aldhelm, yes, Eardulf conceded. For my lord Ethliad, he added, imperiously, which had no impact on Osrith at all, and she turned to Godulf. The law of Mercia says that whosoever should violate a woman is stealing from her husband or father. She glanced up at the incapacitated Sigefirth again. As such, his family owe you were Gild, to the sum of. She looked across at Eardulf, who was now wearing an expression of silent outrage. 14 silver pieces, Eardulf supplied. The man began Godulf. But Osrith raised her hand. Your father was an Angle, was he not? Godulf nodded. His mother had been a Dane, a Christian, and lived to prosper on the Danelaw frontier. So, he accepted the law, and it is the law. She stepped to the householder, whose father had accepted the Wyrgild clause when he himself had killed by accident a fellow Angle who had set up a farm not far from his settlement, and had been tried by Lord Sheulf, ruler of Mercia. Justice had been done, and Godulf's father, Godwin, had accepted it as an advantage of living with the law as meted out by the Mercian border guard. The other farmer's family had been trying to blackmail the guard, and instead, the brother, caught out, had been hanged for this. The story was well known in Ethliad's guard as what was necessary for law and order, and what distinguished them, more importantly, from the Danes. Sigefirth will come with us and justice will be done, she added. You have my word. For a moment, Godulf looked as if he were about to argue with Osrith, and glanced at Eardwulf, who said nothing. Instead, the captain reached into his clothing and extracted a purse of money. It would already contain 14 silver pieces, but Osrith gestured towards the bag. "It contains 14, Eardwulf insisted, sullenly. "By all means count it," Osrith said to Godulf as the man took the bag. But Osrith took the bag from the shawl and tipped it out onto the mean, wooden table. Some of the coins spun, but there were 14. Godulf scooped it up, before striding over to the sleeping platform, and pulled on the unconscious guard's arm, making him fall over the edge of it and thump heavily on the ground before Eadgifu, narrowly missing her son, Osfin. "Get him onto the horse," Osrith insisted as Oshir and Egelfrith carried the man who had attacked Godulf's daughter. The man was moaning, and clearly still alive, and they slung him over the saddle. "So, you are out of Aylesbury?" "We are," Eadwulf confirmed, although he did not seem to like to answer. "And you are out of Daneland?" "Returning from Daneland, in pursuit of outlaws," Osrith replied. Some facet of her words were true. Then, she turned to Godulf. "Can you call your daughter? I would like to speak to her." Godulf said nothing at first, but then moved to his wife. "Ealsfria." His wife called, and the girl, nearly a young woman, appeared at the steading's door, wrapped in a blanket. She was carrying the cudgel that Sigefirth had swung at her. "I'll take that," Osrith said, firmly, as she swung it backwards and forward in her hand, and the young woman was glaring. Osrith noticed, at Sigefirth. "Why was he trying to attack you?" "He was trying to violate me." The girl's words were bare and cold in the morning light. No one moved to interrupt her, and Osrith continued to look at the girl's face, eyes as pale as the Seerskade, who had tutored, hair as blonde, face as emotionless. "Has he tried to violate you before?" "Yes." "And has he succeeded?" "No." There was an audible sound of sighs from both of Ealsfria's parents. This meant a good match for her. Imminently, by the look of her age, Osrith deduced. "He will be dealt with as the law dictates," Osrith reiterated, as Godulf's attention was drawn to Sigefirth again, and she strode over to take the cudgel from Ealsfria, who exhaled deeply as she yielded it, as if she could finally breathe freely without worry and fear of predation. Osrith knew that feeling. "If he is not to be executed," Eadwulf pointed out as Osrith looked southeast, his thin face and dark brown eyes turned to Osrith, "and he is to be taken to Aylesbury, and there are only 4 horses, how will you get there?" "I will walk," Osrith said, and proceeded to take the rein of the horse over which Sigefirth was slung. "Captain Emissary," Oshir declared at once. "Take my horse." But Osrith shook her head, and nodded to the company who were even now heading up the road to take their place. At the head of the 4 men, Elfrith, and Osrith saluted her arm to her astonished friend. Osrith. Beside her, she was aware of Eadwulf bridling at yet another respectful greeting by another man of position, after Osrith had questioned his authority in front of his men, and in front of the shul he had been sent to protect. But, at that moment, Osrith didn't care, and she walked over to Elfrith, who slid from his horse and slapped Osrith on the back in greeting. Ethel was well, he told her, and yes, all was the same at Aylesbury. Aldhelm would be the man to see about Sigefirth. Miral was still commander, and how delightful that Osrith was back where she belonged. That, above everything, was everything Osrith needed to hear. Her friend had welcomed her with such warmth, her position had been confirmed, and best of all, Aylesbury was unchanged in terms of its hierarchy. There had always been a possibility that Osrith would have to negotiate and fight for her position against the will of a man who had not watched her prove herself all those long years in Mercia. And so Osrith walked the 20 miles southeast to Mercia's capital, to see Aldhelm with the errant guard, and to request her position back. For that, she would have to speak to Lord Ethelred,